Everyone, I'm going to start us off. I'm Jinnie Spiegler. I'm so happy to be here. Kira and I, any opportunity to talk about literature and children's books is a great day for us. So in our session today, we're going to explore the power of literature and the power of stories. And I listened to the tail end of Adam's presentation, and there's a lot there also about stories. We're going to talk about how stories and literature can be used not only to teach English language arts skills, but also for social, emotional, and civic learning. We'll also share some specific children's books, young adult books, and adult literature on the theme. And you can, as Denzel said, in the Padlet, which there's a link to, please share as the webinar progresses. Your suggestions of other books, your thoughts about some of the books that we share, we'd really like to hear from you. So just to tell you a little bit about ADL, our timeless mission is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. That's always been our mission. We work on standing up for civil rights, delivering anti-bias education, exposing extremism, and fighting hate online. And in terms of our work on fighting for immigrant and refugee rights, we have, as I mentioned, educational programs and resources. We worked on a campaign on We Were Strangers Too, which has a lot of resources associated with it. We file amicus briefs in terms of our civil rights work, especially on behalf of humanitarian immigration policies, and we speak out in support of when changes about inhumane practices and immigration policies take place. So that's a little bit about us, and we'll do a little bit more at the end. We'll speak for the first 20 minutes, and then I'll turn it over to Kira. So our agenda, the first thing we're going to talk about is the power of literature. We're going to talk specifically about literature about immigration, refugees, migration, and that experience. And then we're going to zero in on different age levels. So first we'll talk about early childhood and the lower grades of elementary, K to 2. Then we'll move into upper elementary and middle school, and then we'll talk about high school and adult. And within those areas, we'll talk about like what considerations for each age group are good to pay attention to. We'll suggest some books, and then we'll zero in on one specific book and share some instructional ideas. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to extend the learning beyond the reading, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you could, share your questions in the chat box, but we'll answer specific questions at the end. And just to say a few things, so in the chat box, there are a few questions we'll ask, so please share your thoughts. The Padlet, feel free to add to that as we move forward, and that will be shared at the end. But also, especially when we're talking about different age groups, please feel free to add to the Padlet your ideas. So the first thing we want you to think about, and please, have your suggestions in the chat box. Think about a book you read in school or when you were a child that really had an impact on you. Please share what was the book and what was memorable about it. Why do you think it really stands out? In what way does it still stay with you?
Oh, I already see Nancy Drew series, which is definitely one that I identified with as well. Charlotte's Web, bringing empathy to the forefront. I see we're using some of the books that are right here. Chrysanthemum. The Giver, that was definitely one of mine that made a huge impact on me, and in terms of how you look at society and destiny. The Outsiders, showing the power of friendships and overcoming obstacles. A lot of great novels here.
Great, thank you. So just keep them coming, and also feel free to share them in the Padlet. So you can see that there is a lot of power in literature. It's not only, and books and stories, not only is it a part of the academic curriculum. So, we're thinking about when children are young, they're learning to read, and as they get older, they're reading to learn, and throughout our lifetime. But literature really connects us to the human condition. These stories stay with us for a long time. So I know that Adam mentioned this briefly, but I just want to go over this a little bit. A lot of, especially elementary teachers, think about the concept in terms of books as mirrors, windows, and doorways. So mirrors are reflections of who children are, and adults and young people, their culture, their family, their race, their religion, their immigration story, and they help people see themselves in books, which is really, really important in terms of self-esteem, in terms of people understanding themselves, and that they're portrayed with accuracy, depth, and complexity. And we often don't see many stories, and there's been a lot of talk about it, needing more diverse books with different kinds of stories by authors who are have those stories to tell. I'll read a quote by Charles Blow. It's one of my favorite things that he said. He's a New York Times columnist and author, and he said, as a young child, books helped me to see myself and love myself. When I felt least seen and least loved, they saved me. So really powerful words there. Then we move to window books, and those are books that help us look out into the world and see others. In this way, books have the power to teach children and all of us about aspects of life for which we may be unfamiliar. So sometimes, especially if we are teaching or working in a really homogeneous environment, it's the first opportunity, it may be, to expose children to different voices and different people. In small and big ways, these books can illuminate differences also between people and similarities. So we can learn about someone who is different than us, maybe someone who is deaf, someone who celebrates a different holiday, or someone's refugee story. And then finally, doorways, which you can see in the last picture. These are, we can think of them as sliding glass doors, as you can see, and readers can walk through in their imagination to become part of that world. And we don't say that we can walk in someone else's shoes, because we know that we can't, but we can try to not see their stories from a distance. We want to move into that world with understanding and empathy. So what do books teach? And we'll talk specifically about some of these immigration and refugee stories and what they teach. But in this genre of literature, books about immigration and immigrants and refugees, there are many connections beyond reading and language arts skills. So, the one part is that the humanities learning. So more than anything else, books really help explore the human condition in all its complexity and its power. We can look at the migration experience in terms of immigration, people who are immigrating, people who are refugees, people who are seeking asylum. Those are all part of the human experience and have been over ages and currently. And all of those stories really have three things in common. They're about leaving somewhere, the journey, and coming to a new place. So these books connect us to and deepen our understanding of other people, their experiences, their needs, their dreams, their motivation, and we can learn more about that experience through the stories. They help us, they can also illustrate aspects of culture. Often these books have, they have in subtle ways and in not subtle ways, we'll learn about that person or that group's culture through language, through artifacts, through things that we just see in their environment. And also the book speaks to civilization and people across time and across borders and boundaries, as Adam mentioned as well. They also can raise ethical questions about what is the right thing to do, questions about justice and questions about respect. And also, what do we do when we see people who are struggling? What's our ethical obligation to help on both an individual and a societal level? And what are our U.S. values about immigration and about people seeking asylum and people who are refugees? What is our ethical responsibility? And then they also raise issues about civic engagement. So many of these books share really important information about what it means to be a citizen, what it means to not be considered a citizen or be undocumented, what we can do in the face of some of these immigration challenges that we see, and how activism and igniting activism, looking at government and the current laws and restrictions that we have and what we can do about it. Even with the youngest children, the picture books that we see, there are many stories about people making a difference and standing up. Just to name a few examples, which you'll see a little bit later, Mama's Nightingale is a beautiful picture book, and it explores one child's voice in their appealing to the judge in their mother's case, who is currently in detention. Amina's Voice is a middle grades book for ages 8 to 12. And amongst other things that happen in the story, a local mosque is vandalized, and it shares information about what the community, most of whom are not Muslim, what they do when that happens and how they come together. And The Front Desk is a book that was recently one of our books of the month, and explores the idea of collective power when a community works together to invest in something that no one could do separately on their own. So that sends a message there. And then finally, character ed. Many of these books give us the opportunity with children and adults to think about moral issues and aspects of our character. There's lots to look at in terms of our self-worth, respect, self-respect, and respecting others, the resilience that we see in many of these stories, and also how we take responsibility to understand others' pain and suffering and injustice in the world. And on both an individual level and a sort of more societal level, how do we welcome people who come here from other places? This can be expanded, especially for children and teens, about welcoming new people into my school, into my classroom, into my community, or into my soccer team. You know, what is that process of welcoming others? And finally, empathy is so important, which I talked about a little bit before, in exposing people, children and adults, to other people's stories and their experiences, their motivations on an emotional level. We see that we can bridge worlds, and books have the power to really foster empathy and understanding other people. And they also help us explore our own feelings to react emotionally to the book itself, and also understanding and connecting with other people's feelings and their situation, which may be different than ours. And so all of these books can serve as both mirror books for people who have had an immigration experience, and also for those who have not, who are learning about that experience in the hopes of building empathy. We know that there's a lot of public rhetoric that it can be very negative around being an immigrant, being a refugee, seeking asylum. And these books are very important to set the foundation for understanding and empathy of people's situations, and to really dispel some of those myths. So in terms of English language skills, for those of you who are currently teaching either children or young adults, there are opportunities to explore all of these aspects of the ELA learning goals. So when we talk about theme, we want to help students uncover and explore various themes in a book, such as how to treat others, how to welcome the stranger, what it means to be a member of a community, what is the right and ethical thing to do, how do we deal with adversity. In terms of the historical context, that's very important. And a lot of times, young people are not as interested in history as they are in what's happening now. And it's a way to kind of ignite that curiosity. So we might read a story about a current immigration story, and it might lead to, and hopefully does, questions and curiosity about what happened in the past, what led to this. The story might be fictional, but it may ignite curiosity about what actually happened in real life. Characterization and point of view, important to think about who's the narrator and who's telling the story. What's their experience and what's their perspective and point of view? We know some of these stories are written by people who have had an immigration or migration experience and some not. So it's important for young people and adults to think about what that point of view is, and also whether characters are portrayed in a complex, multidimensional way. Are there stereotypes? These are all things that we can help students look at, and how is their voice and agency conveyed. The style and author's craft is an opportunity to explore things like setting, symbolism of place and movement, which you see a lot in picture books, There's in a book called The Journey, which is about the refugee experience, we see how light and darkness are used. There's imagery of birds in flight, and you can talk about how are these birds in flight similar, how is that experience similar and different to the experience the refugees in the book are having. And in addition to imagery, figurative language is used both within fiction. There's a great deal of poetry on this topic, and I think Kira's going to get into that a little bit. We can also analyze the author's voice, as we talked about, who's telling the story and what's their point of view. And finally, compare and contrast by reading different books, both about immigration and just other situations that speak to the human condition. We can compare those stories. So we can explore the patterns of immigration, look at the past. For example, there are two stories that are very similar in a certain way. There's a very recent book called Undocumented, A Worker's Fight. It's a graphic novel, and it's about a contemporary story of immigrant workers who come from Mexico to the U.S. to work, and they don't have papers, and they organize about the work conditions and their pay. And then if we look at a book called A Brave Girl, about Claire Lemlich, who came from the Ukraine in the early 1900s and organized the largest strike of U.S. women workers. You can look at those two stories, and they were 100 years apart, and you can compare and contrast those. And also, some of you may know the book Refugee, in which there are 3 refugee stories told, and they take place on different continents and in different time periods. There are many parallels and there are many differences, but their interconnectedness actually ties their story together in the end. So I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. This is where we're going to get into the specific age level, and first we're going to talk about early childhood. And by early childhood, we mean ages 0 to 8. And these are, we would think of children in preschool and in K2. And the books that we're going to share are primarily picture books, but picture books can also be used for older grades, upper elementary, middle school, high school. You just wouldn't do a read aloud like you see in this image, but you might project the pages, and it's a great way to kick off a unit. So some of the considerations to think about are similarities and differences. These are concepts that children are learning at this age. So what makes us different? What makes us the same? There's value in both. Sometimes people are more focused on focusing on similarities, and it's important to look at both. What groups am I a part of? Young people at this age are exploring identity. What groups do you belong to, and what groups don't you belong to, and how does that form your identity? What are the parts of my and other people's culture that are important to me and to others, and were they handed down to me by my ancestors and relatives? Where did I get them? Are you proud in terms of these parts of your identity? Why is pride important? And then finally, moving into some of the challenging parts of identity when we look at bias. And we know that young people who are from certain countries, or who are immigrants, or who are refugees, there is bias. And we have seen that from the schoolyard to our national discourse. So we want to focus on that as well, and also look at fairness and discrimination in a more systemic way. But here are just some books. We're going to zero in on the one in the middle called Dreamers. These books are all picture books. They are at different time periods, different countries, and tell lots of different stories. Dreamers is a book that, it's a beautifully illustrated book. It won several awards that explores what people kind of bring with them when they leave their homes. This book is in English and Spanish. There is an English and a Spanish version. Some books that are bilingual are one book with both languages, but these are separate books. It's a story about a woman who brings her young child to the U.S., and you see them leaving, but you don't know why they're leaving their homeland. You don't know where they're coming from. The book is called Dreamers, but it actually never mentions anything about the dreamers that we refer to in terms of the DREAM Act, young undocumented immigrants who were brought to the U.S. as children. It doesn't mention dreamers in that way, but it is an opportunity to talk to children about what that means at obviously an appropriate age level. So the mother, I'm just going to show you a few pages You can see how beautiful the illustrations are, and the words are just exquisite. The mother and child discover many new things when they come, some wonderful and welcoming, and some familiar, unfamiliar, and suspicious. You can see she says we've made lots of mistakes. They begin to learn English, and they discover books and libraries. They love books and libraries, and learn how to make our voices heard. It's also a story to remind us that we're all dreamers, right? Bringing our own gifts wherever we roam. And this is just the beginning. I don't want to give too much away, but this is the beginning of like some of their dreams. And you can see in some of these images, some of the things they're thinking about. So in terms of the teaching focus of this story, what is immigration and what does immigration have to do with following my dreams? So this is a book that was an ADL Book of the Month. That means it has a teaching guide, and there's an activity in there that explores what children's dreams are for the future. And for a 6-year-old, the future could be next year, or it could be when I get to middle school. So, there would be a discussion about what some of my dreams are, and there's a whole process in the activity around that and how we connect then to other people's dreams. There is this age-appropriate language for understanding what immigration is and who dreamers are. And then there's also an opportunity for students to do research projects. So that's one book in particular, but several of the books that I shared in the prior screen also have teaching guides. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kira, who will begin talking about the next age level.
All right, thanks so much, Jinnie. I also want to point out before I get started that picture books like the ones that Jinnie showed work really well at the upper grades as well through middle school. So I'm going to be focusing a little bit more on chapter books in this section, but from my experience teaching upper elementary, those picture books work great as well. And you have an opportunity to talk about the illustrations and how they contribute to the meaning of the story. So for upper elementary school and middle school students, you're starting to see students advance a little bit cognitively, right? Around 4th grade, they are able to hold multiple ideas in their head at the same time and start looking at more complex relationships between events, people, places, doing compare and contrast and cause and effect studies, looking at how characters change over time. And they're really driven by inquiry-based learning and problem-solving opportunities. Another aspect that is really critical in the 4th and 5th grade level is looking at heroes and villains, right? Understanding heroes' journeys, which is a theme that can be applied across so many different types of texts, including migration stories, and also looking at other characters as antagonists and foils who are driving the plot. So we're going to look at a few books here. These are all mostly you would call them like chapter books, although a couple of these are more poetry focused. There's a really great whole bounty of novels that are poetry, that are just a series of poems that tell a story. Audacity is one of my favorites. So you see a lot of books here that are historical fiction, contemporary fiction, that are the authors may be telling semi-autobiographical stories of their own family or personal migration story. And as I mentioned, you see a lot of narrative poetry. A lot of people mentioned REFUGEE as one that they either really like or excited to read, which has many stories woven together. And it offers a great opportunity, as I mentioned before, of looking at compare and contrast between different people's migration stories taking place at different times. I'm going to focus on Esperanza Rising, which some of you may know. I feel like at this point it is now a classic 5th, 6th, or 7th grade, maybe as young as 4th grade, depending on the level of the reader, novel. And for those of you who don't know, it's the story of Esperanza and her family and friends. They are immigrating from Mexico to the U.S. in the 1930s, and they're moving in pursuit of economic opportunity. The novel actually follows a full year in Esperanza's life, which is a huge year of change for her family, but also a year of personal growth for her as well. And students really get swept up in her story, the challenges she faces, the determination that every single character exemplifies, and the overall message of hope. There's a very uplifting, positive view about your ability to take on challenges and hope for a better future. The first half of the book really explores Esperanza's migration story. What are the push-pull factors that drive her mom and her, as well as their friends, to decide to move, which offers a lot of opportunity to talk about the American dream. What do these characters envision for their life when they move from Mexico to the United States? At a time when there was a big surge in migration in the 1920s and 30s. And then in the second half of the book, you get to see to what extent is that a reality? What other societal structures do these characters come up against? We actually get a chance to look at both the social hierarchies that existed in Mexico and the social hierarchies that existed in the United States, and to some extent also still exist. So you get to make that connection to contemporary trends and current events as well. The second half takes place mostly in a farm company camp in California, and you see not only Esperanza's group represented, her identity group represented, but you see other groups that were experiencing, going through surges in migration in pursuit of economic opportunity. Which will allow for those conversations about social hierarchies, as I mentioned. So these are some of the themes that you might explore. And then you take the learning further. We can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. As Jinnie mentioned earlier, reading books that are historical in the historical fiction genre really ignites an excitement and interest in learning about history. So two great topics that you could look at are the Mexican Revolution. How did that create various push factors for some people in Mexico to move either within the country or move to the United States? Another one would be looking at patterns of immigration to the US in the early 20th century. I know for me, growing up in the Northeast, a lot of that conversation was framed around Ellis Island and European migration to the United States. But we can also look at patterns and through other points of entry, and especially in the Southwest and West Coast United States, immigration from Mexico was a significant pattern to examine. What were the push-pull factors there, as well as what were the push-pull factors for migrants who moved within the United States during that time. This story, as I mentioned, a couple others are, it's almost an oral history for the author. In her note afterwards, she talks about how she is writing some things that connect to her family history, which creates a great opportunity for students to talk about their family history. And I'm going to reference what Adam was talking about earlier. Maybe not every family has an immigration story, but just about everybody has a migration story. So you have the opportunity to broaden our understanding of immigration to migration and look at individual students' experiences and their family experiences. A really highly engaging way to get into this story is to look at all of the different groups and different types of characters and their view on organized labor, which is a big theme and a big topic that this book addresses. So students might get really excited about writing position statements from the perspective of different characters and how they feel about organizing a union of farm workers and going on strike and having that debate in class centered around this main plot point of the story. You also have an opportunity to bring in these nonfiction objects that go with text, like maps, graphs about migration statistics, building timelines, and you can really create these interactive nonfiction resources to see how the author was really capturing a moment in time that was based in fact. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to high school and adult. Before I do, though, I do want to reference that these chapter books, while maybe geared towards middle and upper elementary, are very high interest. So if you have English, you have students who are learning English as a new language in the later years as high school and adults, these books can still be extremely helpful and maybe a little bit more manageable as the students develop their reading comprehension and literacy skills. So moving into our high school and adult audiences, you have an opportunity to examine larger patterns and structures in a society. Students are able to see themselves as part of those systems, but also distinguish between individual stories and systemic experiences or patterns that we see across society. It's also a great opportunity to explore moral ambiguity. While a lot of literature for younger grades, you see protagonist, antagonist, hero, and villain. In high school and adult literature, you have the opportunity to see that everybody has a motivation and that there's a little bit of good and bad in everyone, and there's an opportunity to learn about what is considered ethical or what we believe to be the right thing to do from a lot of different characters. Characters much more multidimensional, which is really interesting to examine. You also get to examine multiplicity in identities, how people can balance many different parts of their identity that sometimes conflict. And I'm going to go ahead and focus on a few different books here. We've got a whole range of books. It's a really exciting time because I think that finally the canon of what is considered core high school literature curricula is changing. Actually, when I was preparing for this, reflected on my high school experience as a reading in my literature classes, and I don't think we read a single story that was a story of immigration. So this is a great opportunity to reimagine what we consider to be the core books that every high school student should read, and challenge those notions a little bit because they definitely tend to be focused on, more on men and more on white authors. So on this page, over on the left, I have a few different graphic novels, and I mentioned this in the chat, especially for readers who are learning English as a new language or who maybe aren't that interested in reading. Graphic novels are a great entry point. And there's really no limit to the amount of complexity that you can get into in terms of opportunities for discussion. Even if the text itself is relatively simple, you have a great amount of art there. You have interesting characters and themes to explore. A lot of times by high school and adulthood, readers have a fixed view of themselves as a reader. They either love reading or maybe they already know that they already don't think of themselves as a reader. So it's important to have that range available to students to find those high interest books that may be a little bit lower in terms of the complexity of vocabulary or of sentence structure, to create those entry points for everybody. So we have on the left, as I mentioned, we have a lot of graphic novels, and then moving towards the right, novels that are increasingly complex, increasingly challenging in terms of the language used or the structure or the way that the narrator or narrators tell the story. So I'm actually going to focus on one in particular, American Street. I read last year, and it's a relatively short novel, but definitely complex and fascinating. And if you don't know it, I highly recommend reading it, even for just your own interest. The author is Evie Zoe Boy. She wrote, as a Haitian-American author, wrote American Street. We have the main character, Fabiola, who is immigrating from Haiti to the United States, and she's immigrating to Detroit. And her mother is detained prior to the beginning of the story. So she ends up living alone with her cousins and aunt, and her immediately faces this challenge that what she imagined her life would be like in America with her family, something warm and welcoming, is the opposite of what she experiences. And it's a really harsh contrast for her. So one of the great aspects is how Fabiola has to hold all of these identities that she either has grown up with or is now embracing as an immigrant, as a member of her newer family, as a young woman, a young Black woman in Detroit, and holding all of those identities at the same time. You get to see the author explore how Fabiola taps into the spirituality that comes from her Haitian identity and use it as a source of comfort, strength, and inspiration as she navigates these different challenges. She's determined to reunite with her mother, and in doing so is struggling about how best to adopt an American identity that fits with her, and reconciling her identity as an immigrant, as well as maintaining her sense of self that comes from her life in Haiti. One of the things I love about this book, a big strength, is how the author uses magical realism to represent Fabiola's spirituality. And magical realism is kind of an interesting genre. It's a Western term that was put upon authors and artists who mostly come from non-Western cultures and often have their own migration stories. But you get to see how aspects of Fabiola's spirituality that are a little bit fantastical, somewhat imaginary, are woven into real events that occur in the story. So that one of the things that is great about this book is that you can get to those very high level literacy skills like author's craft, and you can also access this without addressing those skills because you have a really compelling character with many identities and navigating a very complex set of events. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide and talk a little bit about some of the other teaching connections. So we mentioned magical realism. You could draw comparisons between this novel and other examples of magical realism, both in literature, but also in art. I was an art major in college, so I'm biased, but I think that incorporating art into ELA curriculum is amazing for offering opportunities to explore symbolism, artist/author's choice in a way that anyone can access regardless of their literacy skills. Current events connections will be huge in this book. It is contemporary. The setting is today, maybe 2016 or 2017. And a lot of the events that take place will connect to current events that aren't just focused on immigration. You will also have an opportunity to explore how race relations in the United States, to explore the role of the police in cities in the United States, which would then and which would also lead into the next teaching idea, looking at maps and demographics in urban areas. I think one of the things that this book does really well is show how many American cities are very segregated, and you see a lot of pockets of communities of immigrant origin that may have their completely own space separate from other aspects of the city. And then you see those lines blur as groups come together and either integrate or clash. And so that's something you can explore in the city that is closest to where you live as well as explore it in Detroit through this novel. Fabiola, the character, does a lot to bring her spirituality to the United States and creates spaces in her home that will be comfortable for her. She creates stories based on what she sees around her that connect to her spirituality, and students can do that as well. Students can take aspects of their cultural identity or their spiritual identity and create those artistic representations like Fabiola does as well. And then I think you can do this with just about any book, but close reading some of the really fantastic quotes that you will find in this book and think about what messages the author is conveying. I'm going to go ahead to the next slide. So what you see here are just a lot of really broad ways that you can extend the learning from these migration stories that we see in books. A lot of them Jinnie and I have referenced throughout our presentation tied to specific books, but many of them work across every single age level and across many of the books that we have shown you, as well as the books that are coming up in our chat and on the Padlet. So these teaching ideas, they work across the spectrum. And I want to bring in a pedagogical, I guess, philosophy that I very much identify with. Knowledge best sticks to other related knowledge. So the more time that students are exposed to stories of migration, the more time that they are maybe learning about, they're looking at a window into a culture that is different for them, the easier it will be for them to apply more knowledge to that understanding. So if we are talking about immigration in the past throughout history, that will make it easier for students to see how immigration is being talked about today and make a connection. So looking at current events, doing social action projects, for instance, and connecting that to the world can be really useful. Doing compare and contrast between this text and other artistic representations or between other movies that address similar themes is a very, very powerful thing to do. And we have a lot of opportunity here. I'm gonna go through each of these four categories a little bit briefly. So if we start with like self-to-text connections, from as early as pre-K, you can talk about how students feel, how they would feel in certain situations, how the characters are feeling, and that isn't just limited to those early elementary grades. You can have that conversation throughout. I know that Adam talked about this as well, telling personal stories of home and moving. That works across every single age level. And any story that shows migration and immigration will foster an opportunity for that. and then engaging with the author. Sometimes this isn't always the case, but a lot of the books that we have been talking about that are migration and immigration stories are written by authors who also have their own migration story. And it may be that they're telling a story that is aligned, or it may be they're telling something that is a little bit different. But that making that connection to the author about why did they tell the story? Why is the story important for them? And why is it important for us to read is really helpful. We talk a lot about world to text connections, and especially given what Denzel was talking to us about in the beginning with what immigration looks like today, and then also the trends that we've seen throughout the last 100 years or so, there is a lot going on in the world. Our students are all being exposed to rhetoric, images, stories about immigration happening today, and making those connections in class is so impactful. I talk a lot about maps and timelines. I think it's really helpful to when you're reading a story that may be about a different place or is about moving from place to place, to build a map as a class, or build individual maps and look at exactly where people are moving. It also offers a great opportunity to tie into something else that Adam mentioned: borders. Where do they come from? How have they changed? Just thinking back to Esperanza Rising, that was a great opportunity to look at how the border between the United States and Mexico has changed over time, which really affects the way people think about moving. And similarly, using any kind of historical fiction or contemporary fiction book to build a timeline of the events that take place that surrounding the character. It always invites that question, reading a book about something that connects to real life, is, did this really happen, right? If you read about Esperanza, did farm workers really organize? Did they really live in camps that were segregated by cultural identity? Let's research it. Let's explore. And then from there, turning students outward to, here is what you can do to take action. How could we take what we have learned and use that to make our world a better place, make the world reflect the lessons that we are getting from the stories that we read. Moving over to interpreting the text. These work with just about any narrative, but they also work especially well with migration stories in terms of building empathy and building a deep understanding for migration as a part of the human experience when students are able to look at the story and think about it from different perspectives, tell alternate endings, create additional art that relates to the story, or think more deeply about the character's perspective by writing a journal entry. And then for interpreting the text further as the way it relates to other representations of that same migration story. Let's keep going. Awesome. I'm gonna, now in the last final minutes we have, and then maybe we can also take some questions if there is time, I wanna mention some resources that we have at ADL. At the beginning, Jinnie mentioned some of the work that we do, and teachers, all of you in schools work very, very hard, and hopefully we can provide you some resources that make things a little bit easier. So we have some resources including Current Events Classroom, where we put up lesson plans that tie into what is going on right now in the moment. So that way you can bring that right into your classroom. And these are really great complements to some of the novels and the picture books that we discussed. And let's keep going to our next resource, Table Talk Discussion Guides. The intention of these discussion guides is a tool for families to talk with young people and children about what's going on in the news as well. But why not bring this into the classroom? If you are looking to have a discussion, you need some questions to get started, you need a primer so that every student comes to the discussion with the same information, these can be really useful. They can also be tools that are sent home if you want to make a connection between what's happening in class and offer parents an opportunity to continue the conversation at home. Next, we have our Books Matter page, and I think that we have referenced this, but one of the things that Jinnie and I love the most about what we put on our website is our Books Matter page and our Book of the Month features. So we have a curated list of books that are related to various topics. And so you can sort by topic, like say immigration or identity or ability. And you can also filter by age level. So that way you can find a book that is great for independent reading, read aloud, shared reading for whatever context you are in. And then monthly, we feature one particular book and create a discussion guide for educators and for parents so that you can bring the even more rich discussion about the books into your classroom. We have a few other resources that cover a wide range of topics. I'm going to just touch on a couple in the limited time we have left, but education blogs and Rosalind's Classroom Conversations, which is another one of our guest blog writers, Rosalind Weissman, who's an author that you may know of, just about topics that are relevant to what's going on in education today. And I think in particular for the topic that we're discussing, holidays, events, and special months, we have a number of resources to help schools think about how they honor and celebrate these events in a way that is instructive, that is respectful, that is inclusive. Because some of you may have experienced or seen stories where it can go really wrong and it can make some students feel isolated on the outside. And we want to make sure that schools and teachers have the tools that they need to recognize heritage months or to recognize holidays or special events in a way that's really productive and helpful and brings people together. And lastly, go on to the next slide, the best resource that I want to make sure that everyone here knows about is that we have regional offices all over the country. So you have a thought partner in the work that you are doing to make your school more inclusive, and they're probably pretty close to your area. So if you haven't already done this, go onto the website and just see where is the office near you, because every single one has a fantastic education director who is working to provide training and resources to schools in your area to make sure that schools are inclusive of all students, and especially including our students of immigrant origin.